On the morning everything began, this house did not look like the scene of a crime. Nothing appeared broken, nothing appeared disturbed, and because of that, what mattered most was easy to miss. This video covers a real criminal case involving a child and is presented for documentary purposes. On the morning of December 26, 1996, a 6-year-old girl was reported missing from her home in Boulder, Colorado. Her name was JonBenét Ramsey. According to her family, she had gone to bed the night before after Christmas Day celebrations. But when the house began to stir the next morning, she was gone. What her mother found instead was a handwritten note left inside the home. It claimed that JonBenét had been taken. It demanded a ransom, and it warned against contacting authorities. Despite that warning, police were called. Officers arrived at the house expecting a kidnapping, a situation where time mattered and a child might still be alive. For several hours, investigators operated under the assumption. Then, later that same day, JonBenét's body was discovered inside the house. She had not been taken anywhere. She had been in the basement all along. In that moment, the story of a missing child became a homicide investigation, and the house that had been treated as a place of waiting became the center of one of the most examined crime scenes in American history. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She was the youngest child of John and Patsy Ramsey, a family that had moved to Boulder several years earlier. John Ramsey was a senior executive at a technology company. Patsy Ramsey was a former beauty queen. JonBenét was known publicly for her participation in child beauty pageants and activity encouraged and organized by her mother. She competed locally and regionally, wearing costumes, makeup, and formal attire that drew attention both before and after her death. Within her family and school environment, she was described as energetic, confident, and socially comfortable. The Ramsey household included JonBenét's older brother, Burke, who was 9 years old at the time. They lived in a large multi-level home with several bedrooms, common areas, and a basement. A house that reflected the family's financial comfort and social standing. In 1996, Boulder was widely regarded as a safe and orderly city. Violent crime was uncommon, homicides were rare, crimes against children were especially unusual. The Ramsey home was located in a quiet residential area, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and serious crime was not expected. Because the way people interpret danger often begins with where it happens, and nothing about JonBenét's family, her home, or her neighborhood suggested that something violent was unfolding behind closed doors. At least, not at first. On the evening of December 25, 1996, JonBenét Ramsey spent Christmas Day with her family. They visited friends and enjoyed holiday festivities. By the time they returned home to their house in Boulder, it was already late in the evening. JonBenét, tired from the day's events, was carried upstairs and put to bed by her mother Patsy. Her older brother, Burke, was also in his room, asleep. Nothing unusual was reported that night. There were no known issues or tensions between the family members. The house was quiet through the night. Around 5:30 a.m. on December 26, Patsy Ramsey woke up. She made her way downstairs to the kitchen and noticed the ransom note. This note was found on the staircase leading down from the kitchen. It was a long, handwritten message demanding a ransom and instructing that police not be contacted. Instructions that were ignored. At 5:52 a.m., the first 911 call was placed from the Ramsey home. Patsy told the operator that JonBenét was missing and that a ransom note had been found inside the house. Patsy's voice was later described by those who reviewed the call as calm but urgent. The call triggered the immediate response of local law enforcement. The ransom note was discovered early in the morning on December 26, 1996. It was found on the staircase leading from the kitchen in plain view. The note was several pages long, spanning 2.5 pages in total, handwritten on lined paper. It was addressed directly to JonBenét's father, John Ramsey. The note demanded a ransom of $118,000, an amount that exactly matched John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus. The contents of the note were both strange and specific. It outlined instructions for the family to follow if they wanted to see JonBenet again. It also warned them not to involve the police, threatening harm to JonBenet if they did. Notably, the handwriting appeared neatly executed, and no outside fingerprints were found on the paper or pen, a detail investigators later noted in evaluating where the note may have been written. Despite these unusual features, the note was treated with initial seriousness. The FBI later weighed in, calling it unusual in comparison to typical ransom notes, due to its length and the lack of a clear sense of urgency. The FBI also noted that, typically, ransom notes are more concise and forceful in their demands, but this one was oddly detailed, which raised further questions. At this point, the note itself was seen as both a key piece of evidence and a puzzle in the early stages of the investigation. Investigators focused not just on what the ransom note demanded, but on how it was written. The tone of the note was formal and detailed. It included instructions for how the family was to proceed, including specific guidelines on not contacting the police. This instruction was, however, ignored when Patsy Ramsey called 911 immediately after finding the note. Some of the phrases in the note were unusual, especially considering typical ransom demands. For example, the note read, "We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction." The tone was not frantic or threatening, but rather methodical, which investigators noted resembled an attempt to sound official. The handwriting on the note did not appear rushed, and it was neat and legible. However, no clear handwriting comparison was made to any of the Ramsey family members at the time of the note's discovery. The length and lack of urgency in the language used in the ransom note were flagged as unusual by the FBI, who later described the note as atypical. Ransom notes in many cases tend to be direct and concise, but this one contained extensive details and instructions, which set it apart from standard cases. While the note was a critical piece of investigation, its purpose has remained disputed among investigators and analysts. Upon receiving the 911 call at 5:52 a.m., local police responded quickly to the Ramsey home. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes, beginning their initial investigation. At that time, the house was still being treated as the site of a possible kidnapping. The officers immediately began searching the home for signs of forced entry, but none were immediately identified. There were no broken windows, no sign of a struggle, and no obvious indication that anyone had forced their way into the home. The first sweep of the home was done informally. The officers checked the main living area and the immediate rooms, but the basement, where JonBenét's body would later be discovered, was not part of the initial search. As the morning went on, other details began to emerge. It was later reported that some windows and doors had been found unlocked, but these were not initially flagged as critical. The house, though not formally sealed as a crime scene, was still in a state of disarray, with people moving freely in and out of rooms. Later, attention would be drawn to a basement window. The window had a broken pane, and while it was not immediately considered a likely entry point, it would become part of the ongoing investigation as the case developed. By late morning, hours after the 911 call was made, the search of the Ramsey home continued. The focus had remained on the ransom note and the possibility of a kidnapping, with police working under the assumption that JonBenet was still alive. However, the discovery was made when John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, and a family friend, Fleet White, conducted a second informal search of the house. At approximately 1 p.m., John Ramsey opened the door to a basement storage room known as the wine cellar. There, in the dim light, he found JonBenét's lifeless body. She was lying beneath a blanket, with a cord around her neck and a broken paintbrush handle tied tightly around her neck in the form of a garrote. Her body had been hidden from view under the blanket, making the discovery even more jarring. The scene was quiet. There was no immediate sign of struggle, but the shock was evident. John Ramsey's reaction was described as one of utter disbelief. He immediately called for help, alerting others in the house to what had been found. The discovery marked the tragic end of the search for JonBenét alive. The house, once a scene of uncertainty and fear, was now unmistakably a crime scene. The initial disbelief gave way to the realization that this was no longer a missing persons case but a homicide. JonBenét Ramsey's body was transported to the Boulder County Coroner's Office, where a thorough autopsy was conducted the following day. The coroner's report revealed significant forensic details about the case of death. JonBenét had been strangled with a garrote, which was fashioned from a piece of nylon cord and a broken paintbrush handle. The cord was tightly wrapped around her neck, causing compression. The handle was used to tighten the cord. This method of strangulation was confirmed by visible ligature marks around her neck, which were consistent with the presence of a garrote. Additionally, the autopsy revealed evidence of head trauma. JonBenét suffered a fracture to the skull, likely caused by a blunt force impact, which contributed to her death. The cause of death was officially ruled as asphyxiation by strangulation, combined with craniocerebral trauma, a fatal combination of strangulation and blunt head injury. Further examination documented injuries and findings consistent with sexual assault. There were traces of foreign DNA found in her underwear, though no definitive identification was made at the time. The presence of the sexual assault evidence was noted in the autopsy report, but did not provide conclusive information at that stage. These forensic findings shaped the investigation in the critical early stages, providing a clearer understanding of how JonBenét had died. In the hours following JonBenét's discovery, the handling of the crime scene became one of the most scrutinized aspects of the investigation. From the moment police arrived, the house was not immediately secured as a crime scene. People moved freely through the house, unaware of the potential consequences of disturbing evidence. The Ramsey family, friends, and even law enforcement officers moved through rooms and handled items in the house. This movement around the scene, especially during the initial hours, was later cited by investigators as having contaminated potential evidence. For example, areas that could have contained valuable forensic traces were disturbed, potentially compromising the accuracy of later findings. In particular, the basement wine cellar, where JonBenét's body was found, was not treated as a secured crime scene initially. Family members, including John Ramsey, moved to the area before it was properly sealed off. Later, this was acknowledged as a critical mistake by authorities. Several investigators would later express frustration over the lack of proper preservation, pointing out that early contamination likely prevented the collection of more reliable forensic evidences from the start. The investigators later acknowledged that early contamination limited their ability to reconstruct a sequence of events with confidence. In the years following JonBenét's death, DNA evidence played a pivotal role in the investigation. During the autopsy, male DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing and underwear. This DNA was not matched to any members of the Ramsey family, neither John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, nor their son Burke. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the male DNA found on her body did not match the family's DNA profile. This finding was cited by some investigators as raising the possibility of an intruder, though no definitive link to a suspect was established at the time. In 2008, after years of examination, the DNA evidence cleared the Ramsey family of involvement in the crime. This included all immediate family members whose DNA had been compared to the sample taken from JonBenét's clothing. However, The male DNA did not lead to any conclusive identification. While it was clear that the DNA was not from a family member, it raised complications about the possibility of a DNA transfer, including the possibility of secondary transfer or environmental contamination, as noted in later forensic discussions. The unresolved nature of the DNA evidence left a significant question unanswered. The source of that DNA has never been identified. And how did it end up on JonBenét's body? The complications surrounding the DNA evidence are still a critical part of the investigation, despite the fact that the family was officially cleared by the findings. DNA evidence has remained one of the most crucial aspects of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, especially as new forensic technology has allowed investigators to reanalyze evidence in ways not possible in 1996. The male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing and underwear has been a focal point of the case since it was discovered during the initial autopsy. Over the years, advances in DNA analysis have enabled law enforcement to revisit the case. In 2008, Boulder police resubmitted the DNA evidence to be re-examined using more refined techniques. This process included the use of highly sensitive DNA testing methods, such as touch DNA analysis, which can identify minute traces of DNA left behind by a person who may have never left a visible mark on the victim or crime scene. As DNA testing technology continued to improve, investigators began to explore the possibility of identifying the source of the male DNA. This process has been described by investigators as a potential avenue for identifying the source of the DNA. In addition to refining the DNA testing process, law enforcement officials have stated that they continue to utilize national and international DNA databases to search for potential matches. If a match is found, it could provide the breakthrough needed to solve the case, leading to new leads or even a suspect. While no definitive match has been found as of the latest reports, the hope is that with the constant evolution of DNA testing technology, investigators might one day connect the evidence to a specific individual. In the immediate aftermath of JonBenét's discovery, the investigation began with a focus on the family. Given the circumstances, it is not unusual for law enforcement to focus on those closest to the victim. The Ramsey family, as the last person known to have seen JonBenet alive, were under intense scrutiny from the beginning. Both John and Patsy Ramsey were considered primary suspects of interest by the police. The family was viewed through the lens of what is commonly known as an umbrella of suspicion, where everyone within the household is initially seen as a potential suspect. Despite the absence of direct evidence linking them to JonBenet's death, this suspicion persisted through the early stages of the investigation. In 1998, a grand jury in Boulder voted to indict both parents for charges related to JonBenet's death. The grand jury's vote, however, was not signed. No formal charges were ever filed against John or Patsy Ramsey. Prosecutors later stated that the available evidence did not support filing charges. During this time, the Ramsey family's responses to the investigation were publicly scrutinized. John and Patsy Ramsey made multiple statements in the media, pleading for JonBenet's safe return and declaring their innocence. Patsy, in particular, was vocal in expressing her belief that her family had been wrongfully accused, though she also cooperated with investigators throughout. The early stages of the investigation were marked by a clash between public opinion, police focus, and the ongoing media coverage. Despite the family's cooperation, the shadow of suspicion followed them throughout. As the investigation expanded beyond the immediate family, detectives examined alternative explanations for JonBenet's death, including the possibility of an intruder. One of the most influential voices in this phase was Lou Smith, a retired homicide detective brought in as a consultant. Smith independently reviewed the case and raised questions about whether certain aspects of the scene, including a basement window and surrounding conditions, had been sufficiently explored. Outer investigators, however, maintained that no element of the home could be definitively tied to an outside entry that night. While some doors and windows were found unsecured, none were conclusively linked to an intruder's presence, and no clear signs of forced entry were identified. At the same time, law enforcement pursued numerous persons of interest over the years. These included individuals with criminal histories, people who had interacted with the Ramsey family, and those who later came forward claiming involvement. One of the most publicized developments occurred in 2006 when Jean-Marc Carr confessed to the murder. His claim briefly reignited attention but was dismissed after forensic testing excluded him. No charges were filed. Despite extensive follow-up, none of the investigation avenues pursued during this period resulted in an arrest. By the early 2000s, the case remained unsolved, marked by leads examined but no definitive suspect identified. By the late 1990s, the John Ramsey investigation had settled into a divide that would define the case for decades. This divide was not created by new discoveries, but by how the same limited body of evidence was interpreted. One interpretation held that JonBenét's body involved someone outside the family. Supporters of this view pointed to unresolved forensic elements, the absence of a clear internal motive, and aspects of the scene that were never conclusively explained. To them, the case appeared incomplete, not disproven, but unfinished. The opposing interpretation focused inward. Those who questioned the intruder explanation emphasized the unusual nature of the ransom note, the lack of definitive proof of forced entry, and the early handling of the crime scene. In their view, these factors suggested that the crime may not have involved an outsider at all. Crucially, both interpretations rely on the same facts. What differs was the weight assigned to each detail, and what was inferred from what could not be confirmed. Neither interpretation produced conclusive proof. No intruder was identified, no family member was charged. What remained was not a resolved explanation, but a case shaped by early uncertainty, where evidence existed but clarity never fully followed. In 2006, a man named Jean-Marc Carr was arrested in Thailand after confessing to the murder of JonBenét Ramsey. Carr's confession was bizarre and appeared to come out of nowhere. He claimed he had been in the Ramsey house on the night JonBenét was killed, detailing the crime in a way that seemed to fit the known facts. However, after further investigation, it was revealed that Carr's DNA did not match the DNA found on JonBenét's body, and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime scene. In the end, Carr was cleared and the charges against him were dropped. Despite Carr's confession being proven false, the media coverage was extensive, and his claims drew significant public attention to the case once again. At the same time, the media narrative around JonBenét's death continued to evolve. Throughout the years, the story became more than just a tragic crime. It became a spectacle with frequent updates, public speculations, and a growing list of theories about what had happened. The continuous media attention kept JonBenét's case in the public eye, feeding the public's obsession with the mystery. Yet at the same time, it also complicated the investigation. Reporters and journalists often pushed sensational theories, and the family was repeatedly hounded by media outlets eager for answers. This unrelenting media coverage outshadowed much of the actual investigation and made it difficult for law enforcement to follow a clear path to the truth. In 2008, after years of investigation, the Boulder District Attorney's Office issued a letter officially clearing John and Patsy Ramsey of any involvement in JonBenét's death. The letter, signed by District Attorney Mary Lassie, acknowledged that DNA evidence had conclusively excluded the Ramsey family from suspicion, and it shifted investigative focus towards an unknown male contributor. The exoneration, however, did not bring closure to the case. Despite the clearance, the investigation remained open. The DNA evidence, while ruling out the family, still did not lead to any identifiable suspects. As a result, law enforcement continued to pursue other leads, but the case stagnated. The formal exoneration of the Ramsey family marked a turning point in the case, closing the chapter on them as suspects. However, it also highlighted the complexity of the investigation, which was now faced with the daunting task of identifying an unknown perpetrator. Even though the family was clear, the case would never lose its public focus. New theories continued to emerge, and the desire for a definitive answer remained strong. Yet, the lack of conclusive evidence kept the case open. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey had become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in US history. Despite years of dead ends and public frustration, the case of JonBenét Ramsey remains open to this day. In recent years, renewed DNA testing has continued to play a central role in the investigation. Technological advancements in forensic science have allowed law enforcement to reanalyze the evidence from the original crime scene, with the hope of identifying the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. In 2016, Boulder police confirmed that they have resubmitted DNA samples for further analysis. They sought to refine the testing methods to eliminate the possibility of DNA transfer and focus on identifying any potential match that could lead to a suspect. As of 2021, police continued to investigate new leads and review evidence. Occasionally, public statements are made by officials, assuring the public that the case is not closed and that the investigation remains a priority. Police chiefs have publicly stated that the case is far from forgotten. They have emphasized that law enforcement agencies continue to collaborate with national databases, testing new evidence, and exploring every avenue available to them. Despite this ongoing effort, no major breakthroughs have been reported and no suspect has been formally identified. The search for justice for JonBenét, her family, and the public endures. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey quickly became more than just a criminal investigation. In the years following her death, false rumors and conspiracy theories proliferated, fueled by the media's insatiable appetite for new angles and the public's obsession with the mystery surrounding her death. One of the most infamous internet rumors that emerged was the claim linking JonBenét's death to the Jeffrey Epstein case. Unsubstantiated claims spread online, suggesting a connection between JonBenét's murder and Epstein's network, despite no credible evidence supporting this theory. JonBenét's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, consistently condemned these false narratives, calling them cruel and inaccurate. They publicly expressed their frustration with the endless speculation, which often veered into bizarre and hurtful theories about their involvement in their daughter's death. Despite their pleas for respect and privacy, the public and media continued to circulate unverified claims. This is a pattern that often arises in high-profile, unsolved cases, where the lack of resolution leads people to seek out answers, even when those answers are based on little more than speculation or distortion. The Internet's ability to amplify misinformation has only grown in the years since JonBenét's death. As a cold case without a resolution, it remains fertile ground for conspiracy theorists and sensationalists' headlines. In the absence of official answers, the public has filled in the gaps with stories of their own, some of which have had lasting consequences for those involved in the case. From the earliest days of the investigation, media attention played a significant role in shaping how the JonBenét Ramsey case unfolded. Within days of her death, the case moved beyond local reporting. National news outlets began covering the story continuously, turning a developing homicide investigation into a public spectacle. This level of attention created immediate pressure on law enforcement. Investigators were no longer working solely towards evidence-based conclusions, they were also responding to public expectations, headlines, and the demand for quick answers. Details from the investigation began appearing in the media before they were fully verified. Leaks, partial information, and anonymous sources fueled speculation, often blurring the line between confirmed facts and interpretation. As a narrative formed publicly, they began to influence perception. Once a particular explanation gained traction in the media, it became difficult to correct or reverse, even when new information emerged. Several investigators later stated publicly that public narratives sometimes outpaced the evidence. Media focus also affected witness behavior. People with marginal or unverified information came forward, while others hesitated, fearing public exposure or misrepresentation. This created noise in the investigative process. making it harder to separate meaningful leads from distractions. The sustained coverage had consequences for the Ramsey family as well. Regardless of official investigative status, media portrayal often framed them through suspicion, shaping public opinions long before legal determinations were made. This, in turn, intensified scrutiny on investigators and prosecutors, increasing the risk of decisions being interpreted through a political or reputational lens rather than a purely evidentiary one. Over time, the case became less about a single investigation and more about competing stories. Television specials, tabloid headlines, and later online commentary recycled theories, sometimes long after they have been examined or discounted by investigators. Each new wave of coverage reignited public debate, but rarely advanced the underlying facts. In this way, media attention did not merely report on the investigation, it became part of the environment in which the investigation had to operate. And once that happens, progress becomes harder to measure, and clarity becomes harder to protect. Nearly 3 decades later, the death of JonBenét Ramsey remains unsolved. No arrest has been made, no definitive suspect has been identified, and the evidence that might have provided clarity was shaped by the earliest hours of uncertainty. What remains is not just an unsolved case, but a record of how quickly assumptions can form, and how difficult they are to undo once they take hold. For JonBenét, justice has never been fully realized. For her family, the questions never truly ended. And for investigators, the case stands as a reminder that when clarity is lost early, it may never be recovered. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.